Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beckley Retreat's webinar on marriage. We're talking about the M word today, and obviously, you're all here because marriage is so important to us. And I want to extend a little compassion to you all before we dive in. Look, when marriage was institutionalized centuries ago, we only lived to be 30, maybe 40 years old. Now we're expected to be married for 30, 40, 50 years. So know that and give yourself a pass because it's a long haul. Before we dive in, I also want to introduce our experts. I am so excited that we have with us Bea Voce and Tommaso Barba. Let me start by introducing Bea. Bea is a relationship repair expert. She helps people navigate what it takes to come back together after conflict. She holds an MSW from Columbia University, and she's in ongoing supervision with Esther Perel, who I'm sure you all know. And she collaborates with Columbia University's MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and Rick Doblin on pioneering research into MDA assisted couples therapy. Bea regularly speaks at South by Southwest, and you may have caught her TED Talk on loneliness because it's had over 5 million views. She highlights in that the often overlooked impact of relational disconnection. You can follow Bea and her work on Instagram at Bea Voce, and we'll share that later as well. Our other expert is Tommaso Barba. Tommaso is a PhD research scientist at the Center for Psychedelic Research, Imperial College London. Tommaso's research is focused on understanding the potential of psychedelic drugs for well-being and human flourishing, the brain effects of psychedelics, and the potential role of psychedelic drugs for couples' intimacy and sexual well-being. Tommaso authored the very first research study investigating the long-term effects of psychedelics on sexual functioning. Okay, this is going to be juicy. And let me just introduce myself. Again, my name is Monica Corcoran-Harrell. I am a journalist. I often write about messy relationships for New York magazines, The Cut and the New York Times. Marriage can get messy. We all know that. And I know that in particular because I just wrote an article for The Cut called Why Women Are Quietly Quitting Their Husbands. It went bonkers viral. It got passed around like a bottle of tequila at a bachelorette party. And what I learned is that couples are disconnecting. And we're seeing that this is happening particularly for couples over 45. In fact, there's something called the gray divorce, which you may have heard of. And what we have found is that couples over the age of 45, the rate of divorce has tripled since the 1990s. So we're really in a midlife marriage crisis. So I want to start by asking Bea, so what are some of the factors that are making marriage so challenging for us in midlife?
I want to zoom out just a second because I think it's so important to understand that so many of us have no idea what long-term love actually takes. To your point of we're living longer, marriages are lasting longer, relationships are lasting longer. So even just as you're participating in the webinar right now, I want you to just consider for yourself. I'll do this in front of stages of, it doesn't matter if I'm in front of 50 people or 5,000 people. I ask this question and it's about the same ratio, which is how many of you grew up in family systems that you want to emulate? So how many of you have had growing up relational models from your parents or caregivers that you're like, that's what I want. I want to do that.
Not
Anytime,
me.
same. Anytime I ask that, I basically have like 1 to 2 people raise their hands. It doesn't even matter how many people. And most people are like, nope. So where are we learning how to be in love? We get what it means to merge and have the honeymoon stage, but that's one part that lasts about 6 months to maybe 3 years if we're lucky. And then we have these different stages of relationship that require a lot of work, but where are we learning to do that work? That's really, to me, a central question. Now, transition periods in relationships can be really, really hard, right? Like we all know this. We all know that for those of us who have had children, how hard it is to come into children. We all know that moving can be really hard when someone loses a job, when a parent dies or you're now becoming a caretaker. And then we have empty nesting. So a lot of these transition periods are happening in midlife. So now you have this combination. You have the combination of, I was never taught how to be in long-term love. I was never modeled. I grew up on Disney, Hollywood rom-coms, now in a world of social media that shows us hashtag couple goals that totally does not represent what we're feeling inside and what we're experiencing in our homes. We're combining that with major transition periods that are happening in midlife. And so not only do we not really understand what it takes to be in long-term love, we don't have a map for that. Now enter transition periods that inherently come with a lot of different challenges, whether that's external, like what I'm talking about with a parent, a family member moving, kids leaving the home, right? But also internal, what's happening hormonally, what's happening when we're retiring. Maybe one partner is staying in work and another is kind of leaving and it's transitioning. Like we have so many moments of transition that require us to be able to have the capacity to deal with tension in ways that we have never been taught. So we have
Oh, I
this.
just want to say it's
Yeah,
so
please.
interesting that you say that because the marriage rate for Gen Z and millennials has dipped dramatically. And the main reason a lot of these young people are saying, I don't want to get married, it's because I don't want to have the relationship that my parents had. I watched them detach or be unhappy together. Why would I want a piece of that? And when you talk about those different factors, I think one that's often overlooked that I've seen in my reporting is that women really are coming into their own in midlife, and a lot of them are evolving and they're really excited to start their second act. Meanwhile, their husbands are sort of stuck in stasis. And so this causes a disparity of growth, right? And these men are watching their wives evolve. And it only heightens the fact that they feel like they're living within the status quo. But yeah, how does that impact a relationship?
Well, listen, I'm in a same-sex relationship, and while we're in our late 30s, early 40s, and my wife and I are dealing with a lot of the things that I see in cis hetero couples as well. So what we know though is that from a very young age, and I'm using wide generalizations, and I'm talking mostly about Western cultures,
Right.
um, boys are socialized to treat vulnerable feelings as weakness, and then they convert that hurt into shutdown, irritability, performance, distance, and so actually lose the fluency or never even uh, gain the skill of emotional language early on, right? And so later in adult relationships, they may be partnered with someone who wants emotional transparency, sharing, visible vulnerability, and then both people end up feeling rejected because one person feels like I can never do enough, and the other person feels like I have been screaming from the top of my lungs for years trying to get this out of you, and nothing seems to be changing. There's actually a great book by Terry Real, who's a fantastic couples therapist. It's called I Don't Want to Talk About It. Beckley has a link that they'll either share now in the chat or at the end, that's really about what happens in young boys and male depression that happens that we really do not look at. It turns into addiction, it turns into gambling, it turns into alcohol use, it turns into dissociation. Like there are all of these studies that have been done that we just don't understand a lot about. So
Right.
I find that what's happening in midlife is not just boom, it happens in midlife. No, this is like an architecture that has been formed from very early on. Like we're talking systemic at the very beginning that then just builds and builds and builds. Now we're in midlife where where people start to feel more confident. They're not struggling with money as much anymore. And there are all these various factors that make them feel stable enough, and secure enough. Also hormonal changes, right, that also improve people's confidence and ability to be like, you know what, I'm actually just not going to shove those things under the rug. I don't have that ability anymore, especially with perimenopause and menopause. Right. And so again, it's these combined factors that if we're not looking at the nuances, I think they can hold this kind of overly simplistic view. Like we need to kind of go systemically and look at how we were raised and who we were raised by, that then leads us to years later having complete relational dissatisfaction.
It's so true. I got married at the age of 38, and my parents were not happy in their marriage. And my mom did not leave because she did not have financial independence. She did not have autonomy. She had not gone to college. And I think subconsciously, I wouldn't have said this. In my 30s, I was waiting until I was fully independent before I committed to someone because that imprinted on me in my upbringing. So it is how we're brought up and the modeling we see is so important. I want to talk about intimacy because that seems to be a big measure of a relationship. And I want to get into how we often think of intimacy as strictly physical or sexual relationships. But Bea, can you talk about really what is intimacy? It is not just about how often you have sex and how important it is to a relationship, because that really seems to be the crux of the breakdown of a marriage.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing this up. So I think if we break down intimacy into parts, it starts to not be so kind of amorphous, right? So we have emotional intimacy, which is things like feeling known and understood and being able to bring your inner world to your partner. Then
Right.
there's physical and erotic intimacy. Those are things like touch, sensuality, sex, play, aliveness. And then there's practical intimacy, which is reliability, teamwork, follow through, daily partnership. And at different moments in our lives, different kinds of intimacy are going to feel more important, right? And we'll want more of one than another. There is something called perceived partner responsiveness. It's the feeling of being understood, valued, respected, responded to by your partner. And it's actually one of the strongest research-backed and validated relationship variables we have. These are things like our ability to take cues from our partner. So, for instance, if we're in a fight and our partner says, "Hey, can you please not use that tone with me? I can't stay in the room when you do." It's our ability to, in our heads, we might be thinking, "What are you talking about? Like, I'm like my tone, whatever I'm saying is fine." But what we actually do is we are flexible enough to take in our partner's perspective, the responsiveness piece, right? And say, "Oh, okay, well, that tone wouldn't bother me." You can literally say that in your head. You're like, "This seems crazy that they're bothered by this, but hey, if it bothers you, yeah, I'm happy to shift my tone." Or you're driving, you drive fast and you're driving 7 miles over the speed limit, and your partner thinks that's crazy and it really scares them. And your partner's like, "Hey, baby, can you slow down? I get really scared when you drive that fast." And you might be thinking, 7 miles over the speed limit? Like, what's that? That doesn't
Right.
matter. And instead of saying that out loud and saying, "What do you mean? I'm not speeding." Right? You say something like, "Yeah, yeah, when you're in the car, I'm happy to slow down." The
Right.
thermostat, because what we know is that it's actually not in big moments that our relationships break down. It's in the small, mundane, day to day that our relationships are breaking down because we don't know how to come back together after these micro ruptures happen. And the micro ruptures are what impact intimacy. And if we
And
have
I'm sure they aggregate too. Like those little
100%.
micro ones keep growing. It's like they just gather more and more moss, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Tommaso, I want to get to you. And I know we're going to get into your juicy research in a minute, but I want to ask you to share why and how you measure intimacy in a study. Like, what are the metrics of intimacy? And also, if you could start by telling us how you came into studying intimacy.
Yeah, a lot of interesting, juicy questions, as you said, and I want to actually, yeah, like highlight the importance of intimacy in what you and Bea talked, because like when I started doing this research in psychedelics, as you mentioned, like my focus was trying to understand the impact of psychedelics on sexuality and how they impacted people's sex life, and while I did that, I soon realized that the big impact of these molecules on people's relationships is more about intimacy and emotional closeness and shared reality between partners rather than sexuality. Yes, sexuality can be impacted, but psychedelics are not aphrodisiacs in that sense. Like they don't make you feel like normally, like they can, but like they don't necessarily make you feel like more aroused and sexually attuned, especially when the drug effects are gone. But they can make people more in sync with each other's potentially. So they can be a pharmacological, like, in a way, they can be like a pharmacological love potions. I always use this metaphor because, us as humans try to direct love in so many different ways since the beginning of times, because we know that love is not under our control. And so there is all these folkloristic stories about love potions and how like we could try to find a biochemical mean in order to impact our feelings of attachment. And I would say that now where we are now with like the fusion of psychedelic drugs and other like empathogens as MDMA in our culture, maybe we found it. But the thing is, if you look at like all the stories, like from Shakespeare to Harry Potter, like people that are making emotional decisions under the influence of love potions, they normally end up in chaos. They don't end up in harmony. And that's also something that really fascinated me. And yeah, I think like that's kind of like an initial overview. And why did I become interested in it? It's always been a fascinating passion project. I think I've always been fascinated by love as a concept in science too. Like, what is it? Can we measure it? Can we understand like how it impacts our life and how powerful it is? Like, I'm fascinated by altered states, and love is a profound altered state of consciousness that can resemble in some ways psychedelics. And I started to get closer and closer to this topic through my own life experiences and by my initial exposure to like long-term relationships and how they impacted it and like their intersection with psychedelics. Like I would say I've been very personally inspired, especially in this type of research. And it's been a life journey. Like I went from loving this research through personal means to not being able to engage with it because of my personal life circumstances made me very disillusioned by the intersection of love and psychedelics, and then getting the passion into it again. And I don't know where it leads. I'm still young, and this is still a research very in its infancy, but it's I find it very fascinating, and no one is looking into it really.
So when you're doing a study, how do you, what, again, like how do you study intimacy? Is
Yeah.
it just based upon what couples reveal? And is it their subjective view of intimacy? Are there other metrics to watch
Uh-huh.
them, observe them, and how they interact?
It's mainly like it's mainly through asking them how they feel, and we use questionnaires like the one that Beya mentioned, and then there are a few others like relationship satisfaction, shared reality, sexual satisfaction that are like the most used ones in couples research, and this is a bit an overall like theme for mental health research, like researchers found out over time that there are some ways in order to like understand better like people's subjective experiences, but one of the best ones is just asking them privately how they feel, because
Privately,
yeah, yeah,
not in
yeah,
front of each
yeah.
other.
Yeah, in our questionnaires, we always tell, please complete this away from your partner. They're not gonna see it. And it's fascinating because I've been like looking like I have a couple of studies like running on relationship and psychedelics. One that measures like couples that are doing these experiences in their home settings or like at a festival, like trying to understand, okay, if you take an empathogen or a psychedelic at a certain point in time, how is your relationship relationship impacted over time. So before and after changes. And the other one, it's getting observational data from a center in the Netherlands that combines a high dose psilocybin with relationship coaching before and after the experience. So it's kind of like trying to create a sort of psychedelic assisted couples therapy. And we are also collecting some data on that. And the interesting thing about these questionnaires is that sometimes you see couples that are giving kind of different responses about like how the relationship is. Like you see someone, it's saying, "Oh, we're definitely not considering divorce," and the other one is like, "Oh, we are still considering divorce." And I'm like, "What's going on there?" And
Yes.
it's fascinating because when people are allowed to say what they actually think, it might not be what they actually say to their partner.
Yeah, so much of relationships and marriages are like Rashomon. Everyone's touching a different part of the elephant. So it's very interesting to hear how couples, their perspectives on their relationship and how much they differ. Bea, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about how social media is affecting intimacy. And you recently wrote an article for John Haidt's Substack After Babel, excuse me. It was called Your Marriage Has a Third. It's not a sexy person. It is your smartphone. Tell us about how social media and smartphones are impacting our partner responsiveness.
Well, listen, we have always, for all time and eternity, had ways to disengage from relationships, right? Whether that's through alcohol or numbing out or watching TV or whatever it is. But we have never had as easy of an exit as a phone that lives next to us in all areas of life. I mean, think about it. For many of us, even just, I'll take the category of work. For many of us, we're no longer working in offices. Some of us are, but we take our work home with us. We put our phones in our pocket, so we literally never need to disengage. Not only that, but this kind of, there's a term I like called half presence, which is basically you're partially present all of the time. In the moments of transition where we used to have mundane connection, so think about being in the car or right before bed, or while someone's cooking dinner and the other person's sitting there, or right, these small, seemingly small moments where we used to be able to connect. Now we have our phones there.
Right.
And for there's research that shows for Gen Z, they are there. Many of them have their phones literally next to them on their beds. Like that's where they sleep with them. For many others, it might not be on the bed, but it's literally right next to the bed. It's the last thing we do before we go to bed and the first thing we do when we wake up. So when you imagine a couple who has just, gone to bed, they're like tired, they're exhausted, they're getting into bed. And what used to not have distraction, a place that didn't have distraction, although you could read books, of course. Now, one person gets to bed, the other gets into bed, one of them starts scrolling on their phone, another decides not to say anything. And the phone, as we know, is engineered to keep us engaged. So
Yes.
we're not only anymore comparing one person to another person, we're now comparing a frictionless virtual world that is giving us an algorithm. I don't even have to name a brand. I can think a brand and it shows up on my algorithm, on my feed, right?
Right.
We are given exactly what we need when we need it with no friction. And so now we're not comparing Jimmy John down the street or our friend Sally and their relationship. We're comparing an entire world and then
So
trying to map it on to our very real life experience of being in a messy, complicated relationship, and they do not match the
Mhm.
frictionless world and the messy relationships. And so it feels like something is wrong in our relationship, our real world, because our partner has needs and desires and they get bored and they have questions and they have, right, to an environment that needs nothing from you, to an environment, by the way, that with AI is training to be attuned to us and be empathic towards us, where it is requiring no attunement or empathy on our side. We don't actually have to build that muscle at all for us to get it over and over again, like a quick hit, right?
Right.
Like straight to the veins. Um, so I'll pause there because I can see Tommaso also, and I
No,
want.
I'm actually curious to ask you, and you mentioned it. I'm just want to ask you more questions because you're like so amazing and knowledgeable in this. And I'm like you mentioned social media and then AI, like social media like are attention grabbers, but like AI chatbots are like intimacy, like illusions. And they are
Yeah.
made like I think like social media give us this like endless attention scrolling, but doesn't give you a feeling of intimacy. But AI chatbots, like they are designed to create an illusion of be intimate with you. And I think this is another step that we are not there yet, but I think soon we will like be more and more invaded by it. Like I living in like I live in San Francisco now, and there are like I've been on a couple of talks, and people are already saying, "Oh, like I ended up in an emotional relationship with my chatbot, and I cannot get out of it." Like they're like, "I cannot get out of it. I need to talk with him or like all the time because it's kind of like it became a parasitic sort of relationship." And I think there are more and more of these situations. And yes, there are like the sensationalist ones on newspapers saying, "Oh, I fell in love with my chatbot." I think that's still a bit on an extreme, but people are relying more and more into these tools. And maybe like they talk with ChatGPT all the time. "Oh, like my husband did this, did that." And the chatbot is like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, you're right. And he's an asshole." And I think
Well,
this is going to become a problem.
in our defense, I mean, I think that first of all, I will say I touch my phone more than my partner, and he'll hear this at some point and shake his head. But also to both of your point, they've created an algorithm which they're almost reading our mind, and it's something we expect our partners to do. So when you have social media feeding you information about a topic you're interested in, or you have ChatGPT telling you, "Oh, that must have felt terrible. I want to be there for you." I mean, the standards for our partners to meet are actually unbelievable and unattainable. But I also want to get into the patterns of communication we get into. I've been married for almost 20 years, and I know like we create these dynamics of communication and confrontation, and they become so ingrained. And so I'm curious, Tommaso, let's start with you. Can you give us a history of the use of psychedelics in couples therapy and how that use can rewire these patterns that are really, really hard to break?
Mhm. So like the historical use around psychedelics and couples therapy compared to the other type of research was still pretty limited. It initially had a boom with the use of MDMA in the Bay Area. But, like MDMA was like developed around like 1912 by a pharmaceutical company called Merck to regulate blood, and it was really like not used for like more than 50 years. They tried to use it, they saw it was not that effective, and then they just parked it. And then there was the first psychedelic revolution with the 50s and the 60s with like the synthesis of LSD by Albert Hoffman in Switzerland, and then like the discovery of psilocybin mushroom after like there was this famous Life magazine article where this Gordon Watson, that was a banker and then an explorer, went into Central America and Mexico, and he managed to get an experience out of psilocybin mushroom. And when he talked about it, these experiences kind of unleashed into Western culture. And then there was the first wave of psychedelic research and therapy that was mainly centered around the use of LSD and the use of psilocybin to treat mental health disorders. And there was a period like in the early 60s in which like psychedelic therapy was mainstream in a way. Like people in California and Hollywood, they were using it all the time. There were clinics, psychiatrists were giving it to patients, and it was a big thing. But then psychedelics slowly like escaped the labs, and they started to be used more and more without therapeutic supervision, and they were given to people in different contexts. And the problem was like maybe these drugs were not dangerous, and like now we have a lot of evidence that they were not dangerous, but started affecting people political beliefs and the way in which they reacted to the government in America and the Vietnam War. And so at some point in 1971 they became all illegal with the control Controlled Drug Substance Act, because they ended up being a sort of political threats to the current establishment. And since then, like, research didn't, like, it almost died, but didn't completely disappear. And just after the ban, MDMA started to, like, be explored again. There was this chemist called Alexander Shulgin that lived in the Bay Area, and he started to, like, re-explore some of these psychedelics thanks to a DEA license that he had because of his work. And he rediscovered the MDMA and the pathogenic effects of this drug. And MDMA was initially called as empathy, and and started to be given to therapists because it was not illegal yet, because, like, it was not included in the initial ban of psychedelic drugs. And it started jumping into couples therapy, especially in the Bay Area and around, like, some parts in America. Therapists started to use it in order to, like, facilitate connection and repair and understanding of one partners because of these properties. And there was a brief window in which this was a reality, and then slowly MDMA also became illegal because it started to be used too much in recreational context. And back then, the overall view on drugs was very strict, and so also MDMA disappeared. And since then, psychedelic research kickstarted again. I think we are all aware that there are more and more studies looking at psychedelics to treat various mental health disorders, but the couples research still is in its infancy. There is some more research that is coming up now with psychedelics and couples. From Anne Wagner in Canada. There are, like, some great colleagues, Chandra Khalifan and Kyle Knop, that are doing some ketamine assisted couples
Oh,
therapy
yes,
down in
yes.
San Diego. That it's one of the few places in the world where this can be done legally, and they are doing amazing work. And researchers like me and Bea, we are, like, slowly developing an understanding of it. But in terms of
Yeah,
big
let's
studies,
get into that. Let's get into
yeah.
what you're doing in the practical application. Bea, tell us your work, the work you're doing with MDMA and couples, and what you're seeing from the beginning to now.
So right now in the
Was that
field,
too broad, that
no, no,
question?
no, no. I will say we haven't. I can't talk about what we found in the data because we
Yes.
know, like, preliminarily, but we don't actually have. So I can't talk about but I can talk about a bit about where we're coming from and why we're doing this
Yeah,
work.
and speak anecdotally about your
Yeah,
experiences.
yeah, great. So first of all, in the field right now, the only real information that we have about what works and what doesn't work with MDMA and couples has been, or MDMA in general with people with PTSD and whatnot, has been in clinical trials. That's what we know, right? But what we have not yet explored is actually how most people have partaken in the compound, which is underground. And if couples are doing it in a facilitated way, it's not legal in most places. So unless you're involved in a clinical trial, which most people aren't, they're doing it underground with a facilitator in the underground. So we developed Columbia. I'm working with Columbia University and MAPS to develop a mixed method survey right now, or excuse me, a mixed method study that includes two parts. One is a survey. So we're basically handing it out to practitioners who have been doing clinical trials, but also underground practitioners. And we're starting to learn, okay, so for the underground, how are they getting their MDMA? How are they dosing? What are they thinking about prep and integration? And then we're also doing in-depth semi-structured interviews after the survey with the practitioners, with some of the practitioners who filled it out. So we're trying to fill this knowledge gap, understanding what are practitioner approaches to MDMA-assisted couples therapy that are in the underground, and some who've been involved in clinical trials. Identify common practices, right? Like dosing, screening, what I was just saying, prep, integration, interventions.
Right.
Um, and then basically examine the differences between MDMA assisted versus traditional talk therapy. What are the different processes? What are the different outcomes? What's the difference in treatment durability? And the hope is that what we find it will not only support future protocols, working also with Rick Doblin and some of the people that Tommaso just mentioned, and at Enamory Clinic out of San Diego. They're the ones who do ketamine, and they're also really interested in MDMA once it becomes legal. So trying to support, look, if we can gather some information here about what's happening in the underground, does that actually help inform future protocols and clinical trial development? Because it's
Mhm.
actually how people are using it.
Right.
So that's what we're most interested in, is like, what happens when we take this into the real world and we take this into real life? How are people actually using it? Most of the people who can actually get their hands on it in a facilitated way.
We're going to talk about recreational use versus a therapeutic setting as well. But Tommaso, I just went on a Beckley retreat. I was in Jamaica and took psilocybin twice. And there was a couple there and they purposefully had their own separate journeys. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use it to bridge intimacy, but it's not something that couples are doing together, correct? Tommaso,
Mhm.
in my experience, and obviously this was facilitated in a great experience, but this particular couple that I was there with on this retreat had their own journeys, and it really was not connected. And yet, them having these epiphanies or self-realizations and dealing with their own traumas would bring them together. It wasn't that they were sitting next to each other, holding hands, having a psychedelic experience. They used that experience again to come together. So, can you talk a little bit about the application with couples separately as opposed to what we would assume people doing it together?
Yeah, yeah. So there are a lot of different ways in which this can be done in a relational context, as Vega said, like there is not really like any guideline on how like this should be done. I think like talking about like the high dose psychedelic experience, it is what is normally done in retreat settings or therapeutically, which is around like a dose of dried mushrooms between 3 and 5 grams, more or less. This it's something that like normally people are invited to be introspective and be by themselves, and it's difficult to interact with the outside, and it can be very intense to not be focusing inward because of like the profound alterations that there are in your environment and your access to your subconscious mind, and so like couples are normally asked to be in their own journeys and try to enter where they are, especially in a context like the one of Beckley retreats, where it's more a ceremonial group ceremony. It's kind of like there's not the space to access like your couple issues when you are under the influence of the drugs. And that's normally the same also for ayahuasca ceremonies. And when this happens, partners are asked to be apart in the experience in order to not like enter in relational dynamics that they don't have space to be dealt with in the context of the retreat. And still, as you said, it can have positive effects on the relationship because, like, the intensity of the experience, the complexity that it has, and kind of like the way in which it can resolve issues related to yourself and potentially to your representation of your partner, even if you're not talking to them, can have beneficial effects on the relationship. And there's a bunch of research that shows how kind of like going into intense experiences together with your partner, it's improving the satisfaction in the relationship. That has nothing to do with psychedelics. It is from fascinating activities or traveling, or like there's even this study that in which like they gave like they put couples having dates in kind of exciting places, like a bit thrilling, like kind of going in a Luna Park, or having very like boring discussing days, and it found out that like people that had the more exciting ones were more likely to start dating the other person compared to the ones that didn't have. So this kind of shows that like in general, having experiences in which you create a sense of shared understanding with your partner can be a powerful glue for the relationship. And I think this is one of those cases. But above that is what happens when you combine it with couples therapy, like to like a preparation and an integration that is around the relationship. I think this is when it can have the most beneficial effects. And both psilocybin or MDMA, I think, can be good tools. And we don't have data to say if one of them could have a better effect than the other on the relationship satisfaction. We know that MDMA is more of an empathogen, so it can create more closure and connection on the moment with your partner. But psilocybin, we also found out that it can increase these feelings of shared reality with your partner, or kind of being part of the same interconnected interdependence. And that's also powerful. So I would say it's still open which one can be used. Like underground practitioners use both psilocybin and MDMA depending on their preference, on their feelings with their partner. So it's still such an unexplored venue, I would say.
It's so interesting. My experience on my Beckley retreat, I had a reckoning with the patriarchy my first night. And when I pulled back and reflected on it, I felt a lot of empathy for men. And I brought that home to my husband. So while I didn't think about our relationship while I was having my experience, a lot of the thoughts that I had could relate to our relationship and just what's happening in culture right now. So I didn't expect to have that that outcome, excuse me. It was surprising and actually really beautiful. I'm so glad I felt that way. And I'm also glad my husband wasn't there. But we want to talk a little bit about what can go wrong because we talked last week about just some of the caveats around using psychedelics in an unsupervised setting, shall we say. Because a lot of people, if they can get access to them, they're using them recreationally and maybe thinking, oh, I feel great on MDMA. I feel very loving. Why not do it with my partner and see what happens? What can go wrong?
Yeah, I would
Tommaso,
give.
why don't you start? And then
Yeah, I
Baya,
was about to
Bea,
say,
I
I'll
would
give
love
some
for you
example,
to.
but I would love Bea to be into this because we
Okay.
had a great conversation at Psychedelic Science in Denver about like just bringing stories. Because for now, this is just stories that we have. We don't have data, but we have
Yes.
stories, and but stories can be very powerful and kind of like giving an understanding of what's going on. And yeah, what can go wrong? I'm happy to like talk about like what I heard, some personal experiences that I had, and in general, like what you see when you've been in this field enough. And I think like it comes down like everything. If I can just give a headline, is like that love is a skill, it's just not a feeling. And psychedelics, especially when done without preparation and integrations, can increase the feelings of love, but they don't increase our capacity to be in long-term sustained relationship with our partners. They can maybe when they are combined with like the right approaches, but they don't necessarily do it by themselves. And I think like one of the big problems is like feelings of fake attachments with someone that you love. Like I think they can increase these feelings of strong vulnerability and connection, and and like when you're flooded by like the neurochemicals of MDMA, or when you are in this state of shared bliss under psilocybin, like you can just look at your partner and be like, wow, we feel like we are sharing the same soul, the same like this big strong connection, and then you come down and you can kind of like be completely infatuated by these experiences, or maybe like it's taking down some guards that you have, and then you have this in front of this person, and it can create a lot of hidden dynamics that maybe like are then over time impacting the relationship. And if you don't become aware of them, if you don't talk with anyone about them, you will end up relying on these feelings in order to sustain the romantic connection. And this is a very tricky place to be in. And on the other side is like maybe the relationship will fall apart for different reasons, but if you like created this very strong bond and then it breaks apart, like the feelings of loss and grief can be enormous. And this might not even be the person that was right for you, but your nervous system doesn't know. If you like glued you together and over with like using this powerful biochemical means, if you fall apart, like it can be such a profound loss to face and to deal with. And it's all stuff that I would say you just hear about it. Like there's nothing that like written that will tell you like, oh, this can happen or this other one can happen. But the more you are in the field, you see that there are like all this powerful, complicated stories that are coming out from using psychedelics with in your romantic relationships that we just just starting to get a grasp on, I would say.
Right. And we experience this heightened sense of connection that is almost like euphoric as well. And Bea, I would love for you to talk about once you do experience psychedelics and you feel that connection, perhaps not together, what have you seen in studies that can prolong it? How do we prolong the long-term effects, or how do we translate that euphoria and deep love we felt for a partner and ourselves, which is so important, and apply it to our relationship when we're not in a heightened state of consciousness?
Well, I actually think Tommaso hit the nail on the head, which is that love is a skill.
Yes,
It's
I
a
love that.
verb. It's a verb. And so, and we have been kind of taught that love is a feeling, right?
Yeah.
And so if we're banking on love being a feeling, and then we have these peak experiences, and then that feeling goes away, we're in trouble, right? We have to come back to baseline, and we have to know what to do when we're at baseline. I actually look at these experiences kind of like a diagnostic tool. It's like it gets in there, it does a little work, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, here's our work. This is where we actually need to land. And then the work begins, right? That's really how I see these experiences. And Gul Dolan, who is out of Johns Hopkins, has done some of the most, to me, fascinating research. She did the kind of famous octopus study, giving an octopus MDMA and then watching the octopus become pro-social, which is fascinating. But
I
yeah,
need to read that study.
oh, it's fascinating. It's
You hooked me
fascinating.
with octopus,
Oh, it's completely,
intimacy,
yeah, it's
and
unbelievable.
psychedelics.
It's unbelievable. And what she also has come out with is what we call the critical period or the critical window. And um, each psychedelic or pathogen has a different critical period, which just means the time that your pro-social windows in your brain are open and expanded. With MDMA, it's about 2 weeks. With psilocybin, I study MDMA, so I'm not exactly sure, Tommaso, maybe you know, I can't remember if it's like 3 to 4 weeks, but it's a little, the pro-social period is a little longer.
Mhm.
And so, and with, Ibogaine, it's a little longer. Like there are all these different critical windows that open up, or there's a critical window that opens up with different compounds. MDMA is about 2 weeks. And so what we love to see is that in the 2 weeks following, that a couple is really going into the work. They're really defining what the work is. They're understanding what integration looks like. They're really building the skills so that they can take advantage of that period of time where they have a little more cognitive flexibility than
Right.
they will otherwise, which is why you could see, we see this all the time. I've seen this anecdotally everywhere, which is like a couple comes in, they do an experience, they're good for a couple of weeks, they're good for a few months, and then they go back to baseline.
Right.
So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
really important to have
yeah.
a period of time where you're committed to the skill building that it actually takes to sustain whatever has been uncovered in the experience that you just had.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And be careful what you do in that period. Like protect it and trying to find a way in order to make something out of it. Like personally, and I'm happy to share it, but like I found out of a big, huge betrayal in my relationship a few days after, like a powerful experience that happened together. And that was fully traumatizing. Like I think because of the experience was more traumatizing. And when these things happen, like in more personal context, like you need to protect it because you're fragile for weeks. You're more open to change, but in a positive and in a negative way, I think. And it's an important caveat that I'm happy to end with.
Thank you. I want to open up to questions because we have quite a few. And this is a very interesting one from Veronica. She's asking, I wonder if anyone is doing research about couples who are microdosing, and will it improve the marriage, or are you going to be happily divorced? Wow, Veronica, you really put it on the table. Who'd like to answer that?
Well, I'll say that I don't actually know of any research that's happening that doesn't mean there's not, by the way. So I want to be very clear. And maybe people at Beckley retreats know of this. So I don't actually know, but one thing I find interesting is that the research that's going to be done at a NAMRI clinic in San Diego with Rick Doblin, and we're developing the pilot protocols for that, it'll be a study of 6 to 12 couples. So it'll be a small study, but so far, if you look at these kind of indexes, these relational satisfaction indexes that we're using as, in the research, a lot of them assume that the goal is staying together. And so the indexes actually like leave something to be desired, because you're like, well, okay, what if actually it's best to split? And that's one of the things we want to determine in this pilot study is what's actually best. Is it not that the goal is staying together, but what happens to the relational dynamic and both individuals if the best thing is actually to break up, and not needing to have relationship satisfaction mean that they stay together. So Tommaso, maybe you know some of the more microdose. I'm not sure about any of that.
Yeah, there's just a qualitative paper that looked at it, and it's saying it might have some positive effects, but like there's qualitative paper like work saying microdosing has a positive effects on almost anything, and then when you just test it more rigorously, it finds out that it's very limited the effect that they can actually have, and a lot of it is driven by placebo. So like it's still an area in exploration, but it seems more that like the higher doses can have more of a therapeutic effect. And this is for all psychedelic research, independent on the context.
I have a question where someone's asking, has anyone quantified what percentage of people do psychedelic therapy to come together and end up splitting? I know we often hear anecdotally that when couples go into therapy, they end up splitting. And one of the theories is that they wait too long to do this. And by the time they go into therapy, they're at a real critical inflection point in their marriage. Has there been any study about the, I guess, success rate of using psychedelic therapy in relationships?
No, there's not even studies on like the success. Yeah, just like not seeing yet. But maybe Bega knows something about just general couples therapy that would be interesting.
Well, I will say this is like we're coming together at a time that is really fascinating in terms of couples research in psychedelics. MDMA specifically, again, it's what I focus on, so I'm not sure the world broadly, but we don't have a lot of research here. That's why it's so interesting, because right now with MDMA, most of the research has been geared towards PTSD. And
Yeah.
even the small amount of couples research that has been done by Anne Wagner and Candice Monson, um, it's one person, either it's generally one person taking MDMA, not both partners, and it's usually the person with PTSD. Anne Wagner is working on one where both people will be taking, but nobody has yet done. And again, Anne is working on some of this right now, but where you don't have to have an indication. You don't have to have some diagnosis. You could be a quote unquote healthy normal, whatever that means, right? And we can start to learn what we're seeing with, again, quote unquote healthy normal couples without a diagnosis in these. But this is why the field is so exciting right now, is because this is like the pilot study that we're doing with Enamory, nothing like that has ever been done. Nobody has. So this is brand new. We're just starting to be like, okay, well, if we're looking outside of diagnosis and looking into relationships, what are we finding? It is nowhere. So it's a really interesting time to be in the field.
You know, last night I was on a plane to LA from New York, and the gentleman I sat next to ended up talking about marriage and its challenges. And he said, "Are you in therapy with your husband, couples therapy?" And I said, "No, but we should be, because we are in a great place right now, in my opinion. And what can we learn from how we're interacting right now and apply that when challenges arise?" So, to your point, I think waiting until you're again at that boiling point in your marriage to choose any form of therapy, it's not that it's too late, it's just that you've got a lot of damage to unpack that
Well,
you've accumulated.
not only that, but this is what I've experienced this over and over. I see it in the field. The tricky part about waiting is not only that there is so much to unpack, which is true, but it's also that couples therapy is really hard. There just aren't that many good couples therapists. So if you're waiting until things have hit the fan, then you have got to find a really, really good couples therapist, of which there are few. Now, if you go in earlier, you actually don't need your therapist to be as good because
Right.
you're not in the trenches in the same way. And so you can deal with a kind of like a good couples therapist, but not someone who needs to like get you at, like dig you out of years of resentment, right?
Right.
And so starting earlier, I think, is twofold. It's like, great. So you're not as entrenched and you don't actually need somebody to be as good at interventions as you might, way down the road. Although there is a modality, it's called discernment counseling. So if you're on the edge, if you're thinking, should I stay or should I go? Discernment counseling is like it's like a 10 session process where by the end, the point is to understand, do we
Right.
do we keep working on this or not? So that's also, if you're just at the end of your ropes, that's also a good modality to look into.
Yeah, and a great analogy is if you go to see a personal trainer and you're very, very out of shape and you have a lot to reverse, it's going to be a lot more difficult with a higher chance of failure than if you feel relatively healthy and fit and you see a personal trainer to maintain that. Before we sign off, we're getting close to 10 o'clock. I want to ask both of you just to relay to us, what are you most excited about in your field with psychedelics and couples? And what could we possibly see within the next 5, 10 years or sooner?
I'll say I'm excited for us to actually understand, as people are taking this underground in their regular day-to-day lives, well, probably not day-to-day, but um, what's working for them. I want to know in the real world outside of clinical trials, and we're going to have that information within the next year to two. Like, that's right around the corner. So I am so freaking thrilled about that, because then what we can do is we can now talk to people who are doing the clinical trials and say, cool, here's what we've learned from the underground. Let's try to map this and see what we can replicate. Like, that's a very, very exciting prospect. And listen, Rick Doblin, who is a dear friend and colleague, and really at the masthead of this whole movement, has the craziest dreams and goals out of anybody. It's like why he's been able to get MDMA where it is today. What he's really looking at right now, and who knows if this will be possible, but he has a line that I love where he says, if your dream can be accomplished within your lifetime, it's too small a dream. And he says that what we would love to see with couples therapy, and I'll just get on the bandwagon with him, although I don't know how likely it is that we don't have to have a diagnosis in order to get the drug prescribed. What would
Right.
that be like? And at the FDA, there's nothing illegal about that, but no one's ever done it before. And so what would that actually look like if you don't have to go in with a diagnosis? You're just in a highly stressed state, you have the right support, and you can actually get access to the compound. Like, that's amazing as a possible idea. Who knows how long that will take?
Thank you, Bea. How about you, Tommaso? What are you most excited about in your field?
Yeah,
And let's
it's
keep it
hard to add
within
some.
the next couple of years.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to add something because like I share the same like dreams that Bea has, and I think like for the next couple of years, getting like a small like planning. Like I'm excited to get some of the data that I talked about finally out in the public. Like I have the first big data set on psychedelics and couples that will be probably out with some results in the next 2 years, and that's for the first time that we will have some data showing that MDMA could have an effect over time in your relationship satisfaction or your relationship dynamics or psilocybin. Like, no, like we know that these drugs can be love drugs. MDMA has been known as a love drug for so long, but there's no research that shows that it can have an impact on other like healthy couples in affecting their relationship dynamics. Like, there's no one ever looked at this. And in a couple of years, we will have something that will say something about it. And I think that's a good starting point.
Fantastic. And I'll just say personally, having just done psilocybin at a Beckley retreat, I'm excited for my husband to experience it. And then we can compare notes because it was very much about personal growth. And that is so essential to collective growth in a relationship or a marriage. Tommaso, tell us where we can follow you. Bea, you're at Bea Voce. Tommaso, how can we follow you on Instagram?
Yep. I will give my Instagram handle over here. I do like science communication on psychedelics and sometimes relationship. I do it on LinkedIn too. And those are the two places where you can find most of my work.
Okay, and you can follow me, the Queen of Messy Relationships, as my New York Magazine editor calls me, at Pretty Ripe. I have a platform for women over 40, but men, you're welcome too. I want to thank Beckley Retreats for
Oh,
bringing us together. We were all so excited for this, and I just, this was the kind of chat I really wanted to have. So thank you, Bea. Thank you, Tommaso. Thank you, Beckley Retreats. And again, remember, you will receive a recording of this webinar with the resources that we mentioned. Everybody have a great day. Do not sleep with your phone tonight. Thank you.
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you.